Hi, my name is Dr. Kara Vander Linden, and I'm the founder and the director of the Institute for Research and Theory Methodologies and the director of the Glaser Center for Grounded Theory. Today, I'm going to share with you a discussion with Dr. Odis Simmons as he tells us what it was like to be a student of Barney Glaser and Anselm Strauss at the University of California, San Francisco. His friendship with Glaser and Strauss provided him with a front row seat to the development of grounded theory. Dr. Simmons is also going to share with us some information about the development of grounded theory that, as far as we know, has never been previously shared. I hope you enjoy. Odis, thank you so much for agreeing to be interviewed today. I want to introduce you to our listeners. Dr. Odis Simmons I'm going to introduce him as my mentor. He is the person that I learned grounded theory from about 20 plus years ago. And he was a student of Barney Glaser and Anselm Strauss. And he's been doing and teaching grounded theory for 50 plus years. And probably the most experienced grounded theorist in the world at doing and teaching grounded theory. So Odis, you are one of the very few people left in the world who learned grounded theory directly from Barney Glaser and Anselm Strauss right after they published their discovery book. I know that you also developed a lifelong friendship with Barney Glaser and his family. Can you briefly tell us about how you discovered grounded theory and what it was like to learn grounded theory from Barney Glaser and Anselm Strauss?
Yeah, I actually discovered grounded theory when the discovery book was first published in 1967. I was an undergraduate student at Sonoma State College, which they now call university, which is where Kathy Sharmaz spent her career on the faculty, But and I just was kind of browsing through the bookstore. I spent a lot of time browsing in the bookstore and the library. So I've always loved libraries and bookstores. And I saw this discovery of grounded theory. The title looked interesting, so I picked it up and started thumbing through it. And I thought, boy, that looks interesting. So I bought it. And as I began to read it, I thought, I didn't know much about methodology at that time. Um, and in fact, knew very, very little about methodology. And as I read it, I thought, you mean that isn't the way it's always done? The data comes first and then the theory. It and but it and at the time I was trying to decide what I wanted to major in that book, that sealed the deal for me. And then I read the book, and then sometime later I was taking a class. I took several classes from John Laughlin, who was on the faculty at the time. He's now emeritus at UC Davis. And he was a symbolic interactionist. In fact, all but one of the faculty members at San Francisco's, at Sonoma State at the time, received their degrees from UC Berkeley. Herbert Bloomer was the chair of sociology at uh, at UC Berkeley, and he was the one who coined the phrase symbolic interaction. He was a student of George Herbert Mead, who whose whose work uh, led to the symbolic interactionist perspective. And I might mention, by the way, we talked about this the other day when the other meeting we had. Mead didn't have a PhD, nor did he ever publish anything. He has books, but these books were his notes put together by his students, and they put them together. But he would not even get a job in today's academic world, and which would have changed the history of sociology for sure. And so I was very well versed in symbolic interactionism by the time I left there. And Laughlin was and has been a very successful symbolic interactionist. And I happened to just in a casual conversation mention to him that I really liked this book. And he said, oh, well, they have developed a new program at UCSF. And my wife is in the first cohort. Lynn Laughlin was her name. Very, very nice person. Another very, very well accomplished symbolic interactionist. And so I thought, boy, I want to study under these guys. Um, and then so the next year I applied, but they selected their students earlier than most universities, so they didn't have to compete with the more established departments, and they'd already selected them. So another one of my early mentors, Stanford Lyman, was leaving Sonoma State and going to University of Nevada, Reno, in the social psych program, and he said, well, follow me up there. So I spent a year there, and then I reapplied at UCSF and got in. And so I started at UCSF in 1970, which was 3 years after the Discovery book had come out. And I was in the third cohort. Sharmaz was in the second, and Lynn Laughlin, John's wife, was in the first. And she was the first graduate of that. I think Sharmaz and I might have been the second and third graduates. I'm not quite sure of that. But anyhow, when I first arrived there, Strauss was in Europe consulting with the World Health Organization. And so I took, I can't remember, it's been so many years ago, 1 or 2 quarters, we were on the quarter system of Barney's, what they called analysis course. And Barney lived in Mill Valley, and I lived at the time in Petaluma, which is, north, quite a bit north of there. That time, maybe a half-hour drive. Now about 2 hours, probably, given the traffic there. But and so we would meet in the parking lot at the Safeway store in Mill Valley, and then commute into the city together. That was always interesting to me because I had dropped out of high school. In fact, I still don't have a high school diploma. And the high school I dropped out was right across the street. And I had all these incredible conversations with Barney across the street from the school I had dropped out of. So we just immediately connected with one another. I had 2 daughters. He had 3 daughters. They were around the same age. His oldest daughter at the time, well, actually, I won't give these times. You're not supposed to tell people how old they are, I guess. But at any rate, the 2 youngest daughters, even not only were they the same age, they had the same name, which was Bonnie. In fact, Bonnie sort of runs the whole operation now that Barney's passed on. But we just became very good friends at the time, and our families saw one another socially. We had a huge amount of fun together, and Barney had a swimming pool, and we'd go down to his place, and the kids would play in the pool, and Barney and I would sit there and talk grounded theory all the time. And on our commute, we would talk grounded theory. And on the way home, we would, talk grounded theory. We'd sit in the parking lot in the Safeway store for sometimes an hour, hour and a half, talking grounded theory, and Barney furiously taking notes with these little stubby pens. I don't know how we could write with those things. and a lot of those discussions ended up in his book, Theoretical Sensitivity. It was an adventure learning from Barney, because his classes were, sometimes I've called them, this may be a little overdoing it, kind of an intellectual riot, very free flowing. He treated all his students like colleagues, like he didn't talk down to us. He wanted us to help him explore more about grounded theory, because as both Glaser and Strauss at the time said, that it's really at this point a theory about a methodology, because the only time it had been used is during the death and dying research that they were doing at UCSF. But at any rate, so Barney and I became, lifelong friends, shared a sense of humor, did a lot of laughing together. I really, really miss the man. But and then when Anselm came, they had a party to, greet him back and so forth. And I went to the party, and um, I said to him, well, I've been really anxious to meet you. And then he said something that I always laugh when people do this. He said, no, you were eager to meet me. And I went, yeah, that is a more appropriate word, isn't it? Anyway, and so now when I see people using the word anxious when really eager would fit better, I always chuckle and remember Anselm. But Anselm was just the nicest, sweetest man. Just so kind to everyone, so supportive of everyone. Barney was very supportive of everyone. Um, Barney was not a he was not an institutional man. It's like he some of his colleagues would get irritated at him because he wouldn't go to faculty meetings because he just says, oh, it's in presencing. They never do anything. He's right about that. And but Anselm, he was a real institutional man. He knew the institution, he knew the ins and outs. He was very, very savvy about how to get things done. And I became, I say this, believe me, humbly, they both considered me their best students. In fact, I still have a letter that Anselm wrote for me that just almost brings tears to my eyes. It's so supportive. And so Anselm always made sure, I had a family with 2 kids, little baby even, and well, not a baby, but infant. And he always made sure that I was first in line for money. And so he and we weren't as close as friends as Barney and I were, but he frequently invited me over to his house to have lunch with him and his wife, Fran, and we talked grounded theory. Well, what he thought was grounded theory. And as he's talking, I'm thinking he's not talking grounded theory. He's talking symbolic interactionism, which and I knew quite well. I'd cut my eye teeth on that. He was a symbolic interactionist. But anyhow, I'd taken these courses from Barney, and he talked about, the importance of suspending preconceptions, and not being, he didn't use the term at the time, but not being constructivist, so to speak. And as I said in my book, the term constructivist grounded theory is an oxymoron, because Barney is the one who created grounded theory. Anselm's contribution, the 2 main contributions of Anselm were he helped Barney understand the value and importance of meaning making, because that was not so much in Barney's background, but that's what symbolic interaction is all about. It's how people construct construct meanings to organize and run their lives and so forth. And that's the symbolic interactionist perspective. And he certainly, in the work they did together there, Barney saw the importance of that, which previously I don't know that he had seen as clearly. And the other was that, that at that time Anselm was a kind of a high status sociologist, well known, and kind of still is, and he was on the list of who's who in sociology. And Barney was unknown at that time until the Discovery book. But the earliest statement of what became grounded theory was Barney's article in 1965 in the sociology journal Social Problems, which was probably the number 3 journal in sociology at the time, on the constant compare method, which is either, I don't know, chapter 7 or chapter 9, I can't remember exactly which, in the Discovery book. But that was authored by Barney entirely. That's the guts and core of grounded theory. That's how grounded theory is non-constructivist from the point of view of the researcher. Now, as I pointed out in my book, there are 3 types of constructivism that you need to consider. One is sort of fundamental constructivism, which is the symbolic interactionist position that as my one of my early mentors, Stan Lyman, put it, the one that I followed to Nevada, in a book with Marvin Scott called The Sociology of the Absurd. They start out by saying the universe is inherently meaningless. All meaning is a construction of human beings. You can't avoid that, at least if you adopt that perspective, which I clearly do. In other words, there isn't any kind of solid structure of society. Society is a creation of the ongoing creation of meaning and the interaction between people around those meanings. And so in that sense, you can't avoid that. Then there's the constructivism of the people you're studying. That is how they are constructing their lives to work on their major concerns and so forth, the issues and problems they're trying to resolve. That's a constructivism. But what Barney designed out of, even though he didn't call it that at the time, out of grounded theory as a methodology, was the constructivism, minimizing the constructivism of the researcher, of the theorist, being as non-constructivist as humanly possible. It's impossible to be 100% non-constructivist because we use language and meaning and all that ourselves. But that's where he and Anselm parted. Anselm didn't really understand that. And Anselm was he was a symbolic interactionist to the end. And the first seminar I took from him when he came back from Europe, the first day, he started discussing, here are the kinds of dimensions and issues and questions you want to pursue. And I thought, that's symbolic interactionism. He was talking about what he later termed axial coding. And that violates the original primary canons of grounded theory as Barney designed it. And I saw this real clearly, and it kind of stunned me. And I didn't want to say anything. I just met the guy, and I liked him a lot. He was just, like I say, wonderful and a very good teacher, by the way. I mean, he was just an absolutely brilliant man. I absolutely adored him. So on the way home that day after Barney's seminar, I said, Barney, you and Anselm are talking about the same thing. And it didn't connect with Barney because you know how you can be talking with somebody, interacting with people, and you both think that you're in the same place as the other, and you're not. Because if there's enough similarity, it's easy to believe that. And so it didn't connect in Barney's mind. And he didn't really realize it until the book that Strauss co-authored with Corbin came out. It really upset him. He was hurt and angry, and he wrote a book in response, and he sent me that book. At least up until then, he would send me his books and ask what I thought, and I told him what I thought. And what I told him was, Barney, you got way too much passion in here, and it's going to end up becoming a soap opera if you don't reduce that. He got upset at me, which he hardly ever did. And he accused me of siding with Anselm and et cetera. Well, then he eventually calmed down, but he didn't do anything about it. And what happened? It became a soap opera. That's when the so-called schism happened. Now, the content of the book is actually quite good. It's very clarifying. But that passion, people see that, and that's what they tend to focus on. And whenever I would point things like that out to Barney, he would say, well, they wouldn't make good grounded theorists anyway. So,
and that's the basics book that you're referring to, right?
Yeah, the basics, right. Yeah. People thought the schism was personal, but it wasn't. They remained good friends. Even when after Anselm died, which he did quite a few years ago, he had a heart problem. Barney would visit his wife, who was then in a care facility and so forth, and have lunch with her. And a lot of people thought, I remember once I was at a grounded theory conference, and one of the participants said, oh, Strauss must have been a horrible person. It kind of shocked me. I said, no, he was a wonderful person. But he had believed that he had stolen all this from Glaser, and no, that's just not the way it went down, And Anselm was high status. and he did what was one of the perks of the profession at the time, and maybe it's still that way, um, which is you sign on to the work of somebody else, usually a younger person who's got fresher ideas and so forth. And it helps their career, but the bulk of the work is done by the other person. Well, that's the case with Glaser and Strauss. These are Glaser's ideas at core, what we now call classical grounded theory, which to me is the authentic grounded theory. And I don't mean to say that Charmaz's constructivist grounded theory and the different versions of that are bad research. They're just not grounded theory. I mean, they're a nice methodological addition to symbolic interactionism, but they're just not grounded theory because they violate the central canon, which is to be as non-constructivist as humanly possible. And that's why I consider it to be, consider that to be an oxymoron. But at any rate, Anselm's classes were very interesting. I learned a huge amount from him. It sort of deepened my understanding and respect for symbolic interactionism. But he didn't really get grounded theory, as Barney said in in his retort to Corman Strauss' book. Uh, Anselm never really understood me, and he was right. He was absolutely right. I think it's in a sense it's sort of tragic. It took him so long to figure that out. Maybe I should have been a little more assertive about it. But I loved Anselm. I didn't. It's really hard for me to talk about this because I don't want it to come across as me criticizing Anselm. He was a wonderful man and a brilliant man. But in sort of, I wouldn't say in contrast, Barney was a creative genius. I mean, I've known a lot of really smart people, including Anselm. Barney was just off the charts in terms of the way he thought. He was able to put things together in a way that I can't imagine anyone I've ever known being able to do except him. He picked up what he did when he was in the army in Europe, at the Sorbonne, et cetera. Stuff he learned at Columbia about quantitative methods and theory and all of that. And he just put this all together into this what I think is just this absolutely brilliant method that counters the mistakes made by Emile Durkheim, who was the original sociologist at University of Paris, the Sorbonne. He got the first actual chair of sociology. And when he developed a methodology based upon the scientism model of the quote hard sciences and so forth, using the concept of social facts, that some patterns of human conduct and so forth are so concrete you can treat them as if they're things, and that's the biggest difference between the sort of quantitative view and the sort of positivist view of sociology and the more symbolic interactionist meaning making view. That's the biggest contrast there. But anyhow, it was an absolute thrill meeting them both. I still to this day love them both. Barney and I had so much fun together. And I loved his family. I still love his family. They're wonderful people. It's just, he fundamentally altered my life. It's like my life became very, very different when I met Barney, and not just sociologically or methodologically or theoretically, but in my personal life. By serving as kind of an example. And anyhow, so that's my story up to that point, I suppose.
Well, Otis, it seems like your relationship with Barney and Anselm, for that matter, really gave you a front row seat in observing the development of grounded theory since 1970. Can you tell us more about how Glaser continued to develop grounded theory over the years?
Yeah, you've I'm sure read in more than one of Barney's books if you've read his books. Um, he says, or he said, all is data, and he really meant that. And that's why he used the discussions in the seminars the original seminars I took from him with the other students. There were, I think, 7 of us in there. Although for the life of me, I can only remember 6. At any rate, but I think there was 7 because that was the limit on the number of students they would allow per cohort there. Because we met in an old living room in an old house on in San Francisco on a really steep brick paved hill that Barney and I would have to walk up and down when we went to class, and so for everybody who went there. So he would take notes during those sessions. And one of the things that we spent a lot of time doing was processing data, that is, doing analysis. And he had a very kind of unique way of teaching in that he didn't tell you how to do things. He put you in a position to have to discover it for yourself. So you owned it, which I think can be a very effective teaching method, but for some people, very frustrating and scary. But we got very used to him. He sometimes was difficult for people to understand because, as I told him once, Barney, you're the only Barney Glaser alive, and you think everybody is smart as you, and you're wrong. They're not. They don't think like you initially, maybe more so as they get to know you and listen to you and understand you. But I remember after I just kind of got them. And after some of the seminars, it was not uncommon for students to come up to me and say, "What did Barney say today?" Because they weren't quite clear. But we did a lot of analyzing data, and we would get data from colleagues in other universities and so forth, and we'd analyze it, and we'd bring them in and analyze it for them, so that we would get that practice. The whole time he's taking notes. That's data to him. The conversations that we had during our commutes, that was data to him. The conversations that we had as our children were playing together, that was data to him. And one of the primary reasons he started Sociology Press, which, by the way, at one time was just me in my study, which was a bedroom in my home in Petaluma. I used to take in the orders and then, send out the books and so forth, and I got paid for it. Anselm, they found all sorts of ways to get me money, and that was one of them. But he wanted to talk to the people who were reading his books. And he used those discussions as data for the next book because it enabled him to understand what was confusing to people, what more they needed to know, and it would give him ideas about growing the method, so to speak, about elaborating it more and clarifying it more and so forth. And that's what he meant by all his data. It truly means that. Not only just in the research context, but in the context of how he dealt with life. And that was one of the many important things I learned from him, don't be kind of numb to the things that are going on around you, because they all mean something that could be valuable to you. And so I remember many of my students at Fielding would call to order a book, and he'd answer the phone, and they were kind of, like, wow, he actually answered the phone. But that's the way he did it. He wanted to talk to people to find out, why are you buying this book? What's your understanding? What do you want to get out of grounded theory and these kinds of questions? And that was data to him. And that's kind of how he grew the method. And then as his students started doing dissertations, then he could see how they were doing it. And that was data for him, and so forth. So he was always open to ideas. He was always open to the idea that his students and the people he worked with were colleagues. I remember once I was in one of his seminars in Manhattan, in New York. I said to him, I says, Barney, you always treated me like a colleague. And he went, well, you were my colleague. That's the way he treated me as we're having these conversations across from the high school I dropped out of, and I look back on this and I go, wow, what an opportunity I had by kind of And it all started when I walked into the bookstore and I saw that that's an interesting title and I picked it up. Fundamentally altered my life forever, including right now. In fact, if that hadn't happened, we wouldn't be doing this right now because you might not know anything about grounded theory. I love your story about how when you went to the introductory session for Fielding, and Tony and I were there talking about grounded theory, and you had never heard of it. So I think you called home or something and said, "Look this up." You didn't have at that time you didn't have the smartphones. Like, is this a real thing or just did they make that? Are they just making this up? Which is why I wrote that article once on about grounded theory about is that a real theory or did you just make that up based upon the experience of a musician friend of mine who wrote a lot of songs and so forth and we used to go to his gigs and this woman came up, during the break and said, was that a real song or did you just make that up? He kind of like, well, yeah, it's a real song and I made it up. What makes a song real? What makes a theory real? And before Glaser and Strauss came along, it really was what makes it real is some high status sociologist created it. They conjectured it. And one of my favorite phrases of Barney is without being burdened by data. you know? Oh, and it still, in a way, perplexes me as to how people think that that the theory should come before the data. It doesn't make sense to me even today. Now, I understand how they do that and so forth, and I'm not at all saying that form of research is useless. All forms of research create meaning. I mean, they create information, they create meaning, they create understanding. But the one that I've always favored far and away is what we now call classic grounded theory. I just think it's the best approach. One of the enormously satisfying parts of my life has been teaching it to so many other people like you and then seeing what you're doing with it. It's like it's just absolutely fascinating to me. It's very rewarding and using it in my other professional life as a therapist and counselor and so forth. It's not just useful in an academic context. It's useful in your whole life. And just simple things that I learned from Barney, like if you want to understand why people are behaving that way, ask the question, what are they working on? What process, or I mean, what issue or problem are they processing there, trying to solve? And that's an incredibly valuable question, and it's so simple. Another one was when I was doing my dissertation, which was in the field of alcoholism. I didn't have any particular interest in that, other than several of my sisters died from it, but that was after this happened. But I was interviewing the patients at Laguna Honda Hospital in San Francisco, and I could tell they were just BSing me. Um, and I told Barney, I don't know if I'm going to be able to collect data there. These people won't be straight with me. And he just said, make your problem your topic. Oh, why are they doing it? He says they're doing it for a reason. Find out why. That's what they're working on. And that just opened up my whole dissertation. That just make your problem your topic. What are they working on? Those two questions can be really powerful. And, Barney had a way of getting at the core of things. Um, and I would have conversations with him, and everything. At times I'd tell him, Barney, we're just having a conversation. Do we have to code everything? And he was always coding, and then he would say, "Okay, we'd be having a conversation about whatever," and he'd say, "Okay, what's the core variable?" And I couldn't think as fast as him, and I'd go, "I don't know, what is it?" And then he'd tell me, I go, "Oh, wow." It just would get right down to it like that. And he just, his mind was like no one else's. Anyhow, so I think the shorter answer to your question is he saw everything as data, and he used that data to elaborate and refine what grounded theory is. It wasn't just made up out of whole cloth, which was kind of the tradition. The big sociologists, like one of his professors, Robert K. Merton, they just made up their theories and so forth, out of their own sort of personal genius. And when I first, by the way, was introduced to sociology, before I discovered the Discovery book, I thought, I'm not smart enough to do that. I could never do that. And that's why when I picked up the Discovery book and started reading it, that I can do. I can figure that out because it's got some guidelines. And it was really more, that book was really more about why to do it than how to do it. It was theoretical sensitivity that really got in, told you how to do it. To me, that's the core book. And a couple of the newer ones like Doing, I think, is another one. But that's where Barney really laid out the constant comparative method in enough detail to be able to follow that. And another thing I would say, the difference between Anselm and Barney is Anselm saw grounded theory as one form of qualitative analysis, along with many other forms. He saw it as a method. Barney saw grounded theory as a full methodology, and that's what he outlined in the theoretical sensitivity book. And again, he got that from his idea that all is data.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that difference between it being a method versus it being a methodology?
Well, a method is something that's focused on one task. A methodology is the whole thing. How do you collect the data? How do you analyze the data? How do you write up the data and so forth? It's the full, ball of wax, so to speak. Whereas the method, it's the constant comparative method. It's not the constant comparative methodology. It's the method that the methodology of grounded theory, or what we call classic grounded theory today, uses to analyze the data. But there are also things about collecting data. I mean, all is data, but some data actually is more useful than others. And so, like, you learned when we were doing this at Fielding, you want to try and start if you're doing open interviews, which most people do because it's a richer form of data. You can get right at things, but you want to start with it, and this isn't specifically a grounded theory term, but it's using grounded theory, a grand tour question, just to get people talking about the subject. And a very open question. And I've certainly learned, I used to use that in my counseling and therapy practice, and it was powerful because people would come in and we had to fill out all these forms beforehand where you're supposed to diagnose people and all this kind of stuff before you hardly even knew them, but I always started out with the grand tour question, like, what do I owe the honor of this visit? Let them talk about it, go where it goes. When I started my anger management program, which was based upon the ideas of grounded theory, what I call grounded action, and I started that by saying, this is a new program. I've never done this before. How would you do it? And I took it from there rather than coming in with some sort of preconceived model, as it was very common at the time and is still common, unfortunately. And it completely misses the boat about what people are working on. And when you connect with what people are working on, they're more apt to trust you. They're more apt to be open to you and so forth. But
you and I have previously discussed one area where Barney made a shift in his original kind of conceptualization of substantive theory. So can you tell us more about, because you were firsthand, saw this shift take place. So can you tell us about his shift in how he expressed or conceptualized substantive theory?
Yeah, Anselm and Barney and I sociologists. Our interests were in advancing sociological theory, working within the field of sociology. Um, and I always joke with people, if you're doing grounded theory, you're a sociologist, whether you like it or not. But and so that was their focus. And so Barney's concept of core variable,
Mhm.
yeah, which later on he sort of modified the nomenclature some and referred to it as the core category. But they essentially mean the same thing. I prefer core variable because a variable is core category sounds more static to me. Um, Variable is about action. Um, but anyhow, the focus was on the core variable, not on the substantive area. So he encouraged us to go to different substantive areas to see how that core variable worked out, because you're going to find variations around that core in these different areas. So the focus wasn't on the substantive field, it was on that more abstract level. And that's the way I learned it. I still like that way of it because as a sociologist, there's always the motivating question of sociology is what makes society work. And I, had this fantasy for a long time, and I'm way too old to do it now. you know, I would die long before you finish because it would be like a lifetime work. But that is, I can kind of see a theory of society as being the most fundamental core variables in how they play out on in universally. Because a good core variable is really pretty universal. I mean, the example I gave in our discussion the other day was what Barney called fortressing. A fence is a fortress, a prison is a fortress. It's meant to keep people in and keep people out. A bank is meant to keep people out. Your fence is meant to keep neighborhood dogs out of your yard and your neighbors from encroaching and so forth. But it's all you develop your own kind of little fortress. And that's now there may be societies where you don't find that. I'm not really sure. That's an anthropological question, but certainly in Western societies, fortressing is pretty universal. My original study of milkmen, and my core variable that I discovered was what I call cultivating relationships. You find it isn't just milkmen that cultivate relationships. It's pretty endemic to the way that people operate their lives and so forth. It's like you and part of it would be like what Irving Goffman, the symbolic interactionist, called impression management. He developed what's called dramaturgical sociology, where all Shakespeare, all that life is a stage, and then you have different audiences, and you manage your impressions for those different audiences. Well, we all do that. Anyhow, I'm going off on the side here, but core variables are things that are, if not universal, certainly very widespread through more than just this culture. And that's what's the sort of thing that sociologists are interested in. Well, Barney, he came up with the idea of he was going to try and do what he ended up calling problem solving seminars. And when he put the first one out on his website, there were only a couple of people signed up for it, and he was going to cancel it. Well, one of the people was a student of mine from Fielding. I forget who it was now. And she said, "Oh, don't let him do that." She really wanted to meet him. And so I pulled together a group of Fielding students, um, and got them to sign up. And so it happened. Otherwise, there would be a lot of people today who would not have that option, and they wouldn't grounded theory would have shrunk. I mean, it wouldn't have grown the way it did through Barney's seminars, because so many of the people around the world that are grounded theorists learned it from Barney at those seminars. I think the program we had at Fielding is the only program ever to exist that focused entirely on grounded theory. And in most universities, if it's there at all, it's just part of a methods course. It's just, like 10% or 20% of a methods course, and the people that teach it don't really know it. And so there's just a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding and lack of understanding out there. But I think the two things that have changed that, one is our program at Fielding, which is where you're continuing that growth by what you're doing. And the other is Barney's problem solving seminars. And once again, he used as data. It's like, because we talked about people's projects and so forth, and how they manage them, et cetera. And so it's just all as data.
So it was through those seminars that there was a shift in the conceptualization of substantive theory?
Yeah, because what happens, the people that began signing up for those seminars, just like the people that I got from Fielding to sign up there, they were educators, were people in the applied professions, social work, education, the medical field, particularly a lot of nurses, PhD, working on PhDs in nursing, because that's the program at UCSF was in the nursing school at that time, because there wasn't a social science school. There is now. And so, we had people working on nursing research PhDs in our classes and so forth. I knew many of them. And so these professionals, they have a different focus. They came in, they were doing a dissertation in that specific field, and they wanted to use their dissertation in their field. And then that's when Barney began to focus more on the substantive level than on the just pure methodology level and so forth. And that's when some of the nomenclature changed. Now, I think I probably taught you more the original version of of the core variable being the main focus, and the substantive area being of considerably less focus. Because if you want to find variations, you go to different places, because it's going to be handled differently, and that feeds you data about that core variable at a more abstract level. Well, he shifted that focus because he was dealing with the data in front of him, which is people wanted to do this in a more substantive way. And that's where that shift came from. He followed that data, you might say.
And so the later ones focused more on a substantive theory really related to the substantive field, the setting, and the people that where the people were collecting the original data from.
Yeah, and how that main concern, which led to the understanding of what the core was, how that played out within that profession, within that context. So it was more context oriented than abstraction theory oriented. And what shows the method can be used in more than one way, I mean, it still very, very nicely works on that more abstract level. And the nice thing about the substantive thing is it's so easy to see how it applies elsewhere. I mean, the example I always give is Judith Lee Kissel, her study of doing time in prisons and how that applies to a long airline flight or a boring classroom or a boring job, that the same conditions are there, and the response is very, very similar, even though it's not heavy time, it's light time comparatively to being in prison and so forth. The same categories belong there. And so, as I used to always say, is that grounded theory is movable over space and time if you put it at that more abstract level, and but you can stay on that much more substantive level, and that's how most people, the people who went to Barney seminars, that's how they learned it. And so I know both ways. It's like because at Fielding we were more in the substantive area because people they were professionals. Um,
Well, thank you, Otis. I think that many people aren't aware of that shift because I don't think that Glaser ever expressly wrote about that shift occurring. I mean, he
yeah.
just wrote
Hmm.
about, he addressed
Yeah.
people's concerns, right? And
Yeah.
so he made the shift, but he never actually wrote about that shift and why that shift occurred. And so I think many people aren't aware of that shift.
Well, and
Um,
it also it changed the nomenclature a little bit too, which can be confusing for people. Well, why does he use this here and use that there? Why? Why? Well, that's usually the reason. That this is usually the reason is that shift. I'm not even sure if he was fully aware of how much he had shifted, because he was focusing on today, not yesterday, It's like he was focusing on right now, what's going on right now. That's the data that he responded to.
Well, it's interesting. We call, grounded theory, we refer to it as classic grounded theory, and a lot has been written about, oh, it's that original version that, from 1965 or
Yeah.
1967, right? It's how Glaser originally developed it. And yet what you're showing us here is that Glaser responded to all his data, like all of this feedback that he was getting from people that was using it, and that the method was alive. It grew, it
Yeah. Yeah.
developed over the period of his lifetime, that it wasn't static. So um, we call it classic. I'm kind of switching personally to using Glazerian to capture, now that he's passed away, it's kind of a more common to identify, like, oh, this is the version that he created. And so to capture that over his lifetime, I know when he was alive, he didn't like the use of Glazerian, but
Yeah. He
it
said
kind
it
of
was too
links it,
personal.
right. It links
Yeah.
it to him, though. It links it
Yeah.
saying this was
Yeah.
the version he created, and that it wasn't fixed in time. It developed over time and in
Hmm.
response to the people that were using the method or
Yeah.
methodology.
And there's a sort of tragic element to this, which is I know from very early firsthand experience, grounded theory is Glaser.
I just want to thank you so much for the conversation and being willing to have this discussion about kind of the history of grounded theory over the last 60 years and kind of your experience with it. I do
Well,
want to put a plug for your book. So can you tell us the name of your book?
uh,
Um,
ex experiencing grounded theory.